We've let huge holes form in our social contract. The fact that we're the wealthiest country in the history of the earth, but we don't provide guaranteed health care for everybody. That's a real problem.
That's the voice of United States Congressman Jamie Raskin, representing Maryland's 8th District. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. But first, happy birthday to us. Today's episode marks the 1-year anniversary of Press the Button. To blow out the candles, here are your co-hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
It's our birthday! As Del said, we are blowing out the candles on 1 year today.
Welcome back to all our listeners. What a year it's been. We've had some fabulous guests on over these 52, now 53 weeks. I hope you've had a chance to listen to some of them. And we're very grateful to you, our listeners, for listening at all and for giving us a large enough audience that it justifies continuing this podcast. As you can see, we really like doing it. We have fun doing these podcasts, and everyone teaches us something else about the field, about the practitioners in this field, and as you write into us, about you.
Joe, what's been the most surprising thing for you about this podcast?
Well, how many people listen to it? I'm really surprised when I used to go out and give talks and lectures around the country, how many people would come up to me, saying something or writing into us. For example, we just had a listener write in to say that I mispronounced Ariane Tabatabai's name, and he gave it. But I'm sure I said it the right way. But people listen, people care. The most fun for me has been doing the interviews where I get to go in depth and behind the scenes with a lot of our guests, some of whom hold very senior positions in the government or held senior positions or are out there in the front lines of organizing and analyzing. And I got to tell you, Michelle, one of my favorite segments is when you ask me a question every week. It really puts me on the spot. I'm operating without a net. I don't have any notes. I don't have any history. It's cold and it's quick.
Exactly. I know. I always appreciate your reactions. Yeah. And I totally agree on the interviewee part. I feel so privileged to be able to bring these conversations I'm usually having as a part of my day-to-day job and be able to share them with so many people.
And we've got some great ones lined up for the next couple of weeks, but we'll be telling you about those on Twitter as we go on.
What we're covering this week, on Early Warning, we're discussing the prospects for U.S. withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty, as well as the latest news coming out of the 2020 race for the White House. Despite the news cycle being, saturated, all things coronavirus, these issues continue apace. So that's what we'll be talking about. And since it's our 1-year anniversary, we thought it was only fitting that our interview go a bit deeper than a topical discussion. Our guest this week is Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin, who is a leader of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and also a part of the House leadership. Joe sat down to talk with him about the legislation he is working on to provide relief to ordinary people during this crisis.
We give each of our episodes a title based on the interview, and this week's is called Fixing the Holes in Our Social Contract. And it's based on Raskin's view that we've let huge holes develop in our society over decades. When we see now, for example, that victims of the pandemic are disproportionately in communities of color, that reflects the inequities in our society on income, on jobs, on access to healthcare. And what Raskin wants to do and what he discusses with us is how he and his colleagues want to shape the next economic relief bill that Congress will pass to start to fix these holes. He is extremely insightful, very smart, very knowledgeable, a key player in the Congress. I think you're going to like this interview.
And following the interview, I will be asking Joe a question from Lucy, a listener in Hawaii. After the episode, we'd like you to join us in celebrating our first year of Press the Button. Follow at Press Button Pod on Twitter as we take you through every episode we've produced. It's a great way to catch up on those episodes you might have missed. Let us know which one is your favorite.
Our birthday wish is to hear from you. Please subscribe to this podcast. That ensures that you get the news and interviews delivered to you each week, and then you can decide whether you want to listen. Give the podcast a rating if you like what you're hearing, and share it with your friends and family. But right now, we've got a lot of birthday to celebrate, and the clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. Today I'm joined by Alex Bell, Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, and Akshai Vikram, Hale Fellow here at Plowshares Fund. Thank you both for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Both of you know how this works. We have 7 minutes to cover the world's nuclear news, and our time starts now. Alex, media outlets like The Guardian and The Hill are reporting about the Trump administration's renewed efforts over the past couple weeks to withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty, though there has been no confirmation at this point from the Trump administration. Leaders in Congress, our allies in Europe, have all issued statements opposing this. Why is the Trump administration pushing this now?
It's hard to say exactly why the Trump administration is diverting any efforts right now from the COVID-19 pandemic response. But I would have to say it's probably because this is a treaty that some people in the administration have wanted to leave for a while, mainly because they think that Russia gains more from the treaty than we do, and there are these various implementation problems we've been having. But I can tell you that we actually overfly Russia at 3 times the rate that they overfly us in this treaty. It's a 34-nation treaty that allows us to do overflights over each other's territories, taking pictures of military facilities, installations, equipment, etc. It creates predictability and stability. This is actually an Eisenhower idea that was implemented by George H.W. Bush. And our allies like it, we can fix the problems we're having with the treaty. So it's really defies logic and reason that the administration would want to drop out of yet another international agreement in the midst of a pandemic, against the wishes of our allies.
So how do they fix these problems? What should they be doing instead?
There are 2 main implementation problems we're having with the treaty. One has to do with the frozen conflict in Georgia, and under the terms of the treaty, you have to enforce a 10-kilometer boundary on the borders of countries that are not a party to the treaty. Now, Russia recognizes Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the breakaway republics in Georgia, as independent nations. So if they're going to keep up that little charade, then they have to enforce the 10-kilometer boundaries. So it's not really a problem with the treaty. It's a problem with this frozen conflict, a political problem that we could be working diplomatically. The other problem is a boundary limit that Russia has been enforcing over Kaliningrad, a flight restrictions not permitted under the treaty, but they've already started softening that position. We actually, in cooperation with the Latvians about 3 weeks ago, did an overflight at Kaliningrad that went past 500 kilometers. This is a technical problem that we can work through. It's just going to require a commitment to diplomacy by the Trump administration, and that's not something they have a great record on.
Thanks, Alex. Something we'll continue to watch. Akshay, last week, Senator Bernie Sanders withdrew from the presidential race, leaving former Vice President Joe Biden as the presumptive Democratic nominee. There's been much discussion in the media about how Sanders pulled Biden's campaign to the left on issues like healthcare. Did we see a similar pull on issues related to national security and nuclear weapons policy?
So Joe Biden has actually had a pretty strong track record on arms control going back to his days in the Senate. And he was a key part of the Obama administration's ability to win ratification of the New START treaty in the Senate in 2010. I would say that during the campaign, he's made several promises already that should reassure non-proliferation and arms control advocates. He's promised to reduce arsenals in the United States. He's promised to extend New START. He's promised to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. And he's even this month criticized some of Trump's Iran sanctions during the coronavirus pandemic. Also, in the closing days of the Obama administration, he seems to have been one of the, unfortunately, few members of the administration pushing for a no-first nuclear policy that the United States would never be the first to start a nuclear war. And we could see renewed efforts along that if he does become president in 2021. And he's also opposed new nuclear weapons. He said we don't need any more. And that includes the low-yield nuclear weapon that Trump rolled out, the low-yield D5 that we've been talking about on this podcast quite frequently. There are two areas where there's more room for concern with Joe Biden's track record on arms control. One is North Korea. This is an issue that really stumbled the Obama administration, as they admitted when Trump won election. And it's unclear what Joe Biden's going to do that will succeed where Barack Obama did not. He's been inaccurate at times, saying that Trump has weakened North Korean sanctions when he has, in fact, strengthened North Korean sanctions. And he's been a bit neglectful of the need to partner with South Korea in order to come to any solution on denuclearizing the entire Korean peninsula. And the second issue, which is a little bit concerning, is that about more what he is not saying. And this is something where he might be able to learn from Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. It seems that without the sort of structural critique of how the Pentagon budget is formulated, it's going to be very difficult for any president to tackle corruption and lobbying in the defense budget and procurement process. And unless that happens, it's going to be very difficult to kill these wasteful programs like the new ICBM.
Alex, how do you see it?
I would say, while there may be rhetoric differences between Biden and some of the former candidates in the race, I think when it comes to issues like North Korea, the real thing to focus on is that should he be elected, you would see a fundamental change from the approach the Trump administration has taken. I believe Vice President Biden would empower the experts at the State Department, the very people who negotiated the JCPOA, who learned lessons from the agreed framework. They would really be put in a position to go and do the work that needs to be done. And so that would, in and of itself, be a vast improvement on our current conditions.
Well, something that we will continue to follow. Our time is almost up, but before we leave, I just wanted to give a shout out to Akshai. You just wrote a piece in Responsible Statecraft about the need to avoid war with Iran. I know we dedicated a large portion of the podcast last week to this issue. Where can people find the article?
The article is on the Quincy Institute's Responsible Statecraft publication, and it's an interesting take at some Roman history as well as some nuclear and sanctions-related stuff. So please check it out.
Well, with that, our time is up. Alex, Akshai, thank you for joining.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Michelle.
We're here today with Representative Jamie Raskin, who represents Maryland's 8th Congressional District. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, Representative Raskin.
Delighted to be with you, Joe.
And in full disclosure, you and I are neighbors. I live a few blocks away from you, but we're doing this, as we're doing everything these days, via Zoom conference. I want to talk to you about a series of letters you just released with your fellow members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. You sent some letters to the House leadership detailing your priorities for the next economic relief package dealing with the COVID pandemic. Most recently, on April 10th, you and 80 other members and over 900 organizations sent a letter with 5 principles you said should guide our response to the pandemic. You say that these choices that we make during our response to the pandemic will shape society and policymakers for years, if not decades. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you're hoping to achieve?
Well, it asserts the obvious point that our public health is completely intertwined with our economic and national security. We could be voting $2 trillion bailout packages, either on a top-down Republican philosophy or a bottom-up Democratic philosophy for perpetuity if we don't deal with the pandemic itself. In other words, we've got to solve the public health crisis, or we will bankrupt ourselves by continuing to bail everybody out. And so this is a vivid demonstration of the fact that our public health is integrally intertwined with the security of the economy, the health of the economy, and the security of the nation. But having said that, we do want a bottom-up approach. I mean, the main thing is to make sure that we get the people through the crisis. I think that our unemployment provisions are a vivid demonstration of the philosophy we've been pushing. I mean, basically, we've gotten unemployment up to around 100% of what people were making before. People are thrown out of work for no fault of their own. We should be able to help carry them and their families through the crisis so that they're able to bounce back and have resiliency when all of it is over. I mean, that's the way that the European countries have designed it, and that's the way that we're doing it. So I feel good about that extra $600 check that the feds are adding to people's unemployment benefits, and the fact that we've extended unemployment by 13 weeks to try to get people through the crisis. So that's, we want the investment in the hospitals and the public health care system, in the scientific research in the states and the cities. And then we, of course, had to make the bargain with the Republican Senate, and their major commitment was into creating that $434 billion slush fund for industry, for the hotels and the cruise industry and the airlines and so on, which isn't to say that there shouldn't be some aid that goes there, but we would have liked to have done it ourselves and figure it out rather than just, give it to the White House and Secretary Mnuchin and they hand it out. We were able to attach some restrictions like no buyback of corporate stock, no dividends, no CEO and executive bonuses and so on, and no money could go to the president's own family businesses, and no money can go to the businesses of members of Congress families either. But even with those little principles hemming it in, the fact is that it's a fantastic sum of money that has just gone into the White House, the Treasury, and the Fed to give away to the corporate sector.
Yeah, you serve on the House Government Oversight and Reform Committee, and as a former staffer on that committee, I'm very conscious of the key role that congressional oversight plays. The president seems to be undermining the provisions that you put in the last relief package, firing inspector generals, for example. How worried are you about that, about the oversight over that $500 billion slush fund? And what do you think Congress can do about it?
We passed a $2 trillion package that dealt with everything from the hospitals to testing to unemployment insurance. The one thing that the president talked about at his signing statement was the fact that he rejected the oversight panel that we created, and he rejected the inspector general's authority in the Treasury Department to review what's taking place. Right after they had agreed to it and Mnuchin signed off on it, then he said that he rejected it. And then when Glenn Fine was appointed as the first inspector general, then he sacked him before anything really happened. This is a president who rejects any independent oversight of his actions. The presidency has been a money-making operation from day one for him and his family, his business friends, and his political allies. And he feels like all of the democratic structures that are in place in our Constitution are an impediment to what he wants to do.
During the considerations about the impeachment of Donald Trump, you were one of the leaders suggesting that we look at the corruption issues involved and not just the Ukraine issue. And I heard you give lectures on the emoluments clause and why this was so important in looking at the behavior of the president. Do you think we made a mistake in not focusing more on that during the impeachment deliberations?
Well, I think that they go together. But yes, absolutely. I was pushing both the foreign emoluments clause and the domestic emoluments clause as the original sin of the Trump administration. When he was sworn in that very day, he said no, he was not going to divest himself of his interests in more than 500 businesses that he owns all over the world. And having made the really outrageous and scandalous decision to keep them, and then he said he would not develop a rule that he would not do business with foreign governments. Mm-hmm. In other words, he would continue to do business with foreign governments. That is a direct, naked violation of the foreign emoluments clause in a way that no president has ever done before. And they just began collecting millions of dollars at, Trump hotels, golf courses, licensing deals, real estate all over the world. To the point where he admitted it. Basically, at one point he made a payment of $450,000 to U.S. Treasury, saying that it represented the profits that he had earned from foreign governments at the Trump hotel. There were a few problems with that. One is that the Emoluments Clause doesn't ban profits from foreign governments; it bans any kind of payments at all. Two, he didn't give us any sort of accounting of what the payments were, so we had to trust him for it. And three, you can't take any of it without the consent of Congress. So he bypasses Congress because he doesn't accept any oversight or any checks and balances, and he just says, "I'm going to write this check instead." It was flagrant. So I do think that it was a flaw of our impeachment strategy that we didn't start with what is nakedly obvious to anybody who looks at it, which is that the presidency has been converted into an instrument of profit and self-enrichment.
Yeah. In the April 10th letter you sent, you detailed these 5 principles. I'm going to read them real quick. Health is a top priority for all people with no exceptions. We should provide economic relief directly to the people. We should rescue workers and communities, not corporate executives. And we should make a down payment on a regenerative economy. And finally, protect our democratic processes while we're protecting each other. Let me ask you about these last 3. And do you think we'll be able in the next relief package to do this, to rescue workers and communities, not corporate executives?
Well, I think that the essential allocation of political power has taken place already in the CARES Act. We can continue to fight for more investment, especially in frontline health workers. I think there's tremendous sympathy in the country for them. And I think that we will be able to get, some greater protection for workers in the workplace and, OSHA rules that guarantee personal protective equipment for workers in different kinds of public and private settings. In the healthcare industry, in the grocery industry, postal workers, I hope. So that we may be able to make some limited progress there. But basically, we've got to look at the underlying political reality and the correlation of political forces. The Republicans control the Senate. The Republicans control the White House. They controlled the Supreme Court. We've got basically the Democrats have 1/2 of 1/3 of the federal government. This crisis has exposed so many of the inequalities and injustices in our society and the maldistribution of wealth and the maldistribution of power. So I know people now are demanding and insisting that we do more, and we're going to be fighting to do everything that we can. But the bottom line is, welcome to my world. We've been running into the power of Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump ever since this started. And so we're going to need not only to expand our majority in the House, but we're going to have to win back the Senate to turn things around, and we're going to have to win back the White House. And, even then, unless we get 60 votes in the Senate, we're going to be limited in important ways, especially with a right-wing Supreme Court set to try to strike down anything we do on totally trumped up and invented constitutional grounds.
One of the communities that you singled out that needs more relief rather than what they've gotten so far is the District of Columbia. That was included in your package of priorities, and then you sent a separate letter, I think, just on the district. What's the issue there?
I was very happy that we sent this letter out. The GOP majority and Mitch McConnell slipped a provision in the CARE Act saying that the District of Columbia will be treated as a territory, not as a state. And DC is almost always treated as a state for purposes of distributing program funds like highway funds or Medicaid funds or whatever it might be. And yet by treating it as a territory, and the people in territories don't pay federal income taxes. And by treating it that way, the district stands to lose $750 million in addressing the COVID crisis and responding to both the public health and economic dimensions of the crisis. And so it's a naked and malicious use of power just to stick it to a community of 700,000 tax-paying American citizens who are not represented in the Senate and have one noble non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives, Eleanor Holmes Norton. And so here you see how the power to cheat people out of democratic self-government and voting rights also becomes a power to impair their ability to protect the public health. I mean, that's a really dangerous situation. So I felt it important to have a separate letter, not organized by Eleanor Holmes Norton, because she's so heroic in how she's always standing up for a community, but coming from people outside saying this is an unacceptable way to treat fellow American citizens. I mean, can you imagine the French National Assembly cheating the people of Paris out of their fair share funding for public health measures?
You're getting a lot of members to sign these letters. If the District of Columbia letter, for example, has almost 100 signatories. I mean, this is a big block of votes. Is this a sign about how the increased clout of the Progressive Caucus? And do you think they'll bring that clout to bear on this next economic relief legislation?
Yeah, I have felt for a long time that progressives provide the intellectual energy and the volunteer energy and the money and the passion for the Democratic Party. And I definitely feel that way about the Democratic caucus in the House. And I think that, when we get through this, we're going to be in an age where the progressive spirit is dominant. And, at this point, we will end up with a national healthcare system just as a necessity. It may be that the COVID crisis was able to do in the final analysis what Bernie Sanders' campaign didn't do. And it was remarkable what the Bernie movement did do in terms of changing the consciousness of America. But I think the COVID crisis makes it plain as people, I think 17 million people have been thrown out of work. That means 17 million more people now don't have health insurance. And that's a huge bureaucratic problem, and it's a huge public health problem and a moral problem and political problem. At a certain point, we just have to say we are one society, and there are certain basic functions that we have to use government to meet. And that's why we have government in a democratic society.
Is this what you mean by the fourth principle you detailed in your April 10th letter, which is make a down payment on a regenerative economy? Is this what you mean? So start using this relief, these hundreds of billions of dollars of aid to start to move the economy in that kind of direction?
Well, I think that's right. I think inevitably we're doing it by a long overdue and belated investment in scientific research, in the stockpiling of ventilators and masks and gowns, all those things that we're just caught completely flat-footed with, and the president stuck his head in the sand for 2 months, even after we knew about COVID. But the investments we're making now have got to be a down payment in running a real public health system and being concerned for the health of every single individual. And we've got to do the same thing with our elections now. I mean, our elections are extremely vulnerable to public health pandemics, natural disasters, and military and national security situations. And so it makes a hell of a lot of sense to invest in mail-in balloting options the way a bunch of states have already done.
I'd like to talk more about that as we end the interview, but let me just stay on this the economy point for just a minute. Because this gets at the relationship between domestic spending and Pentagon spending. 60% of all discretionary spending now goes to the Pentagon. Is it time to rethink that balance? In the last few weeks, there's been a flurry of articles, and I've written one of them, about how the pandemic should change our definition of of national security, that we may be forced now to redefine what constitutes our national security and readjust our budget priorities. Have you been thinking about this? And if so, what are you thinking?
Well, absolutely. We either need to completely reallocate our budget priorities, so we're investing in the real problems and needs of the society, or if we're going to keep putting most of it into the military budget, then we're going to have to redesign what the military's functions are. And you're already seeing that in this crisis where a lot of people are saying, well, look, all the money is over there. There's a $700 billion defense budget. Let's get them to do X, Y, and Z. Let's start calling on them. I think it would be more logical for a democratic society to be able to call things what they really are, and invest in them directly rather than making everything a matter of military and national security. But look, I think of it in social contract terms. Why do we have a social contract? I mean, if you go back and you read John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, and all of them said, before you have a social contract, you've got a state of nature, which Hobbes said is, violent, nasty, brutish, and short. Basically, it's a war of all against all. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a society governed by law, where we try to meet people's needs, and everybody will give up a little bit of that radical freedom to just go out and kill other people in return for the greater security that we all get. Well, we've let huge holes form in our social contract. We've had this discussion going on for years about gun violence, and we compel kids to go to school under the truancy laws, but then we don't protect them against gun violence, so they're sitting ducks in schools all over the country. That's like a very serious problem that the vast majority of democratic nations don't suffer from because they have reasonable gun safety regulation, and they don't allow people to go and buy weapons of war, at gun shows or on the internet, and then show up in public buildings and mow people down. Well, that's part of the social contract that needs to be repaired. The fact that we're the wealthiest country in the history of the earth, but we don't provide guaranteed health care for everybody. That's a real problem. And it's not just a problem for the people who don't have health insurance. It's a problem for the rest of us, because if the COVID pandemic has shown nothing else, it's that my health is totally related to your health, and your health is related to everybody else's health. So we want everybody to be healthy. I think most civilized societies have figured that out. So that's a very important part of our security under a democratic social contract. Now, we could redefine all that stuff as national security, I suppose. And, if that's, that just shows the rhetorical dominance of national security, as the paramount priority. So that, we have to call everything national security. But I guess in the final analysis, all of it is. If we can't take care of people's health care, if we can't protect kids at school and other people walking down the street from gun violence, it does disturb the peace and the harmony of the nation. It certainly does not allow us to deliver on the promise of the social contract, which is that we'll be safer, we'll be more secure, we'll be happier within the organized political society than we are if we're outside of it.
And that brings us to budget allocations. The fiscal year 2021 Defense Authorization Act is now slated to be a little over $740 billion. And that was a deal that was struck last year as we decided the allocations. But the House Armed Services Committee has delayed the markup of this bill. And in so doing, they may have given us an opportunity to rethink that deal. Now, I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit because while you sent most of these letters as part of the leadership of the Progressive Caucus, you're also in the House leadership. So you're kind of like sending letters to yourself. There's no way we're going to rethink that $740 billion allocation if the House leadership doesn't want us to. Do you see any opening here for such a reconsideration, for saying, we don't need quite that much. We can slice $20 or $30 billion off, say, and move it over to pay the bills for these other expenses that we now have because of the pandemic?
I think that is a conversation that we definitely can have. People today have a lot more to fear from the coronavirus and from other potential pandemics and from a weak and erratic healthcare system than we have to fear from radical Islamist terror, simply because it's just not as much of a threat to the American people anymore. That's not what's got everybody hiding in their basements today. We've got to pay attention to the full panoply of governmental functions and social needs. And they have to do with health, and they have to do with mental health, and they have to do with education, and they have to do with economic security. And so I think we've let things just get totally out of balance there. And we've got to think of those things as also essential components of our social contract.
Finally, I want to ask you about this November. Sometimes it's easy to forget. We actually have a presidential election coming up, and already COVID-19 has had an outsized effect on not just the primary campaigns, but how people physically vote for candidates. How are you thinking about squaring voter safety with making sure people can actually vote in November? And are you worried about any possible shenanigans that might be tried to delay or influence the November election?
Well, it's all shenanigans from the GOP side. I mean, that is the political business model. I mean, it's all about suppressing the vote, limiting the vote, confining opportunities to register, scrubbing the rolls clean of a lot of people who belong on the rolls, and spreading fear and propaganda and disinformation about the election. So yes, I'm afraid of that. But look, we've already seen what they've got in mind. That Wisconsin primary election that took place this week on Tuesday was an absolute nightmare. The governor of the state said it is not safe for people to go to the polls. Let's do what Maryland and dozens of other states have done. Let's postpone the election to June, and we'll have the mail-in option. I mean, this mail-in balloting, which is now in lots of states like Oregon and Washington and Utah, it works. The voter turnout is much higher under mail-in balloting than on states that just have the traditional show up at the polling place on election day. And that's why Donald Trump hates it, even though he himself uses it. He voted by mail in New York. He voted by mail in Florida when he started voting there. And now he's, concocting all of these deranged conspiracy theories about mail-in balloting, but it's worked great. We don't know of any corruption or fraud except for in North Carolina, where Republicans tried to, get a bunch of absentee ballots and, steer them in a direction they weren't intended for. But other than that one episode of Republican voter fraud, we don't know of any episodes of voter fraud associated with mail-in balloting. And it's what we need to do, because people are going to be terrified to go to the polls. You saw what happened in Wisconsin, where the governor said, let's move the election. And then the Wisconsin Supreme Court, packed with Republicans, overruled him and said, you can't do that, compelled an election the next day. Precinct polling places across the state were closed because they couldn't get anybody to go and work the polls, because how would you like to do that in this environment? And the average age of a precinct poll worker in America today is like mid to late 60s. So we're not talking about young people risking their lives. We're talking about older people risking their lives. So then in Milwaukee, they ended up with, I think, 5 polling places open for the entire city of Milwaukee. And then we saw those lines of hundreds or thousands of people in masks and gloves waiting in line to go and vote. Basically, the Republicans were willing to subject people to the threat of contracting the virus in order to limit turnout because they think that somehow with some of their pollsters or whatever figured out that they think that mail-in voting hurts them, which, number one, I don't know if it's true, and number two, it should be completely irrelevant. We've used mail-in balloting for a long time with absentee ballots, and the states that have been using it for everybody have made it work. And so I'm committed to making this part of our next round of legislation. We need at least $2 billion now to go to the states through the Election Assistance Commission to get them the money that they need in order to write the contracts and to put the systems in place to have mail-in balloting.
Now, I am strongly in favor of that, so I just want to go into this for a little bit more. $2 billion to ensure what? Voter rights, mail-in balloting, both? Yeah,
to ensure that every voter will have the right to cast his or her ballot by mail. Look, if states want to, and we don't know where we're going to be with the coronavirus crisis, but if states want to continue to keep polling places open at everybody's precinct and they think they can find workers to do it, that's fine. If they want to do what I think Governor Hogan has worked out for Maryland, which is that we have our early voting sites open in Montgomery County. I think we have 8 or 9 early voting sites, and those would be open and for Election Day. Okay, for people who want to go out and do it, fine. But the other way is you just say everybody's got the right to mail their ballot in, and we'll do real education on how to do it because we haven't had a statewide mail-in election, but everybody's at home, and basically we'll send you the ballot at home. It arrives, you fill in your ballot, and then you mail it. It's that easy. Or you can have a drop-off option too. If you'd rather just take your ballot, fill it in, and then go drop it off someplace, that works as well.
So I would expect this to be a big fight over the next relief bill because Mitch McConnell said he's dead set against this. The House leadership has indicated they want it. What do you think? Who's got the leverage here?
Well, logically, their position is completely indefensible. So I think we're going to be able to make a far more compelling case to people across the country. Already, people are expressing in public opinion polls that they're afraid to go in to vote. Do we really think that boards of elections in thousands of jurisdictions across the country are going to be able to enforce proper social distancing and public health protocols, and that there's going to be all of the right sanitizers and gloves and masks and so on? Why do we need to go through that? We have a very simple option here. And the Republicans are demonstrating their political cowardice and insecurity. They're basically saying it's going to work so well that the country is going to be convinced that we should just move to this every place, and they don't want it because they want to keep voter turnout down, and mail-in voting drives voter turnout up big time, not just in America, but in all of the countries that use it. By the way, it's also going to be a great thing for the post office to be able to do it. The post office. The post office
is struggling these days.
They are struggling. And these, we got to think of the letter carriers as frontline workers, just like the nurses and public health workers and grocery workers. I mean, they're going to everybody's door and they're out there all day long, and they need our support too.
Great. Well, Representative Raskin, I've kept you longer than I promised, but it just was a terrific interview. It was wonderful talking to you. We are so lucky to have you in the U.S. Congress, and I feel honored to have you as a neighbor. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
It was a great pleasure and honor as always, and I'm always here for you when you need me for anything. It was really a lot of fun.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
Joe, are you ready for your favorite segment?
I am. Let's go.
Today's question comes from Lucy, a listener in Hawaii, who asks, who was the best nuclear weapons president of the 20th century and who was the worst?
Wow. Oh, that's good, Lucy. That's very good. And I'm very impressed, Michelle. We're getting these questions last week from Alaska, this week from Hawaii. This is great. Thank you for listening. Well, I'm going to tell you my favorite, but first I'm going to tell you sort of my sympathetic favorite, and that's John F. Kennedy. And that's because he was clearly the most eloquent of the presidents on this. I mean, the speeches he would give, whether it's his American University speech talking about the limited test ban treaty, which he got, wanted a complete test ban treaty. This is back in 61, 62, couldn't quite get it. Settled for this limited test ban treaty banning tests in the atmosphere, outer space and underseas. But when he's at the UN and he talks, and I quote this at least once a month, that we all live under a nuclear sword of Damocles hanging by the slenderest of threads that can be cut at any moment by miscalculation, accident, or madness. He really captured the anxieties of the nuclear age. And of course, there's Harry Truman, who dropped the bomb and then tried ferociously to stop the spread of the bomb, offered to give up U.S. nuclear weapons and put them under the control of the United Nations if all other countries would swear never to develop them. And there's a lot, but I got to tell you, I have to say my favorite is unexpected, and that's Ronald Reagan. And when I was on staff of the House Armed Services Committee and then Government Appropriations, I thought Ronald Reagan was the devil. I mean, I thought this guy was building up the nuclear arsenal and it was during the time the Plowshares Fund was founded, 1981, because Sally Lilienthal, our founder, thought that Reagan was going to blow up the world. He and Leonid Brezhnev, the head of the Soviet Union. But he really did believe in the abolition of nuclear weapons. He said it over and over again. We must abolish these weapons from the face of the earth. A nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. And when he had the chance in Reykjavik, Iceland, in a summit with then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, he came agonizingly close to abolishing all nuclear weapons, all of them, every single one, every kind, give them up. Couldn't quite get that deal, but then he went on to negotiate the INF Treaty, which destroyed 3,000 perfectly good brand new nuclear weapons, and then to start the negotiations for the START Treaty that began the reduction process, and he broke the back of the nuclear arms race. Up until that point, the U.S. and Soviet arsenals have been going steadily upward. We had almost 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world, mostly in the hands of the U.S. and the Soviets. He broke the back of that. He was the pivot point. We started declining ever since, and we've gone steadily down. The presidents that followed him continued that tradition until now, until Donald Trump has stopped reductions, stopped the negotiating process, is destroying Reagan's treaties, destroying the arms control architecture that Republicans and Democrats built up. And without tearing off into a tear on Trump, let me just say that for that reason alone, because of Ronald Reagan's earnest beliefs in abolition of nuclear weapons, which I share, and his actions to actually do something about it and effectively turn the corner on the nuclear arms race and head us towards abolition, Ronald Reagan is my favorite nuclear arms control president.
And who was the worst president in the 20th century?
Okay, this is hard. Now, if you would ask me overall, I'd have to say Trump. Trump is the worst one now, period, because he's not only building up our nuclear arsenal, not only committing us to $2 trillion in new spending on nuclear weapons, but he's tearing down the arms control architecture, destroying the nuclear guardrails. He's by far the worst. No one has done that. But if you're going to limit me to the 20th century, I'd have to say there are two contenders. And the first is, ironically, Ronald Reagan in his first term, where he launched this nuclear buildup. Remember, he won campaigning against Jimmy Carter on the so-called window of vulnerability, where he insisted that we were now vulnerable because the Soviets could launch a devastating first strike, a complete crock promulgated by these group like the Committee on the Present Danger, all wrong. But he set off a modernization program that cost, at the time, hundreds of billions of dollars for new MX missiles and ICBMs and submarines and warheads, etc. He corrected that in his second term. But overall, I'd have to say good old Ike was probably the worst nuclear president, not because he was in favor of nuclear war, not because he was ideologically in favor of it, but because of what he did. during the 50s, we went nuclear nuts, and Eisenhower allowed that to happen. He really didn't believe in nuclear weapons, but he let the generals, he let the contractors build 20,000 nuclear weapons during his term. When he came in at the beginning of the 50s, we had about 300, 400 nuclear weapons. By the time he left, by the time Kennedy was inaugurated, we had 20,000 in all spheres, on ships and nuclear cannons, long-range missiles, short-range missiles. Ike was greatly responsible for the nuclear madness that plagued us for decades. So I'm sorry, Ike, he gets the reward as the worst nuclear president.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.